Hello and welcome to this new episode of Bootstrapping Your Dreams here. And I'm so excited about this one because this is about one of the favorite topics I don't get to talk about. It's space exploration. And, I've been crazy about space since I was a kid. So here today we have a very special guest, Jim Keravala. So Jim is an extraterrestrial robotics expert. Okay. So what that means is he not only sends things into space, but he also makes them do tremendously dangerous and useful things. So Jim has a proven track record of successful execution across diverse sectors and regions, both living and working in Europe, Africa, Russia, Middle East, North America. And the story goes that when he was not able to secure funding for his ambitious projects, he decided to become a billionaire on his own and fund his ideas, which we can all admit are somewhat out there, and of course, no pun intended. Jim is a visionary, yet result-oriented entrepreneurial individual. He builds systems engineering. He's an engineering leader, driving growth through incremental, profit-driven, achievable milestones. He has established engineering teams and full pipeline enterprise establishments from concept strategy, modeling, engineering requirements, design, implementation, capital raising, venture funding, corporate formation, and market penetration. Jim possesses deep expertise in the systems engineering and launch of over a dozen spacecraft to low Earth orbit, augmented with financing, software, venture capital, construction, shipping, transformation, sector experience, establishing a comprehensive leadership platform for building new space and technology infrastructure. Wow, Jim, you have achieved so much. I'm so honored to have you here.
Thanks very much. It sounds like I wrote my own press release there.
I'm sure I missed a lot of your accomplishments. So let's maybe just go through over that. Your life journey, quite interesting. How did it all come about? Like how did you get interested in these crazy ideas that nobody can even comprehend?
Well, it all started. My passion for let's say the objective of getting humanity off into space in a big way has been really since I was a kid. I'd read at an early stage a little bit of a cartoon version of the works of Malthus about closed system economics from the 17th and 18th century time frame. And being a space nut at the time, I extrapolated that to the Earth as a closed system and thought, well, if it can happen for cities and nation states, this can happen to Earth sometime. So it just seemed logical that, well, the thing to do is to make sure Earth isn't a closed system, whenever that may be a problem. And so it just became an ingrained calling for almost the last 40 years now, to just build infrastructure out into space and set up the highway so that humanity can get out into the solar system, into the stars.
And we're not just talking about sending people to Mars. You are looking at even beyond that, yeah.
So it's a funny thing actually, because many of us have passions and callings about what's important to us and what drives us, and those of us who are really passionate, enthusiastic about space, very few of us are lucky enough or fortunate enough to have the opportunity to be able to execute into something as well. So some of the space nuts, of which I am a proud cadet, can often have very far-reaching visions, and these visions can fall into the visioneering segment of science fiction, which inspire and drive us all. So the real interesting intersection that I find, that I have, is how to articulate a long-term vision that serves some existential purposes, three fundamental purposes, to ensure that humanity is immune to an existential extinction through asteroid impact, idiocy, supernovas, or whatever. The second is to use the resources of space, particularly near Earth space, to improve life on Earth and improve life across a whole range of categories of environment, quality of life, articulation and execution of the rights of every individual as a equal member of species, and any number of those other activities that include access to energy and resources. And then the third, so the first is existential risk mitigation, the second is improving life on Earth, and the third is let's just get out of that frontier. There's I think humanity, and in fact at a Darwinian level, any species thrives and succeeds at its best when there is a leading edge of either mutation for non-agent based development, or where there is agency or intelligence and drive, passion and desire to push the envelope, the spirit of discovery and exploration and wanting to do good things, whatever the intrinsic motivations are. And I think geographically, our civilization has kind of lost that edge over the last 100 years, 150 years, perhaps. I guess from a Western-centric perspective, you could say California in the US was probably the poster child of the last great frontier. And that's not to say that the other parts of the world and cultures haven't had their frontiers, but as a global species, we've had our last frontier about well over 100 years ago. And I think it's now time to rekindle that edge and that spirit, so that that fraction of a percent of folks that really want to push the envelope, to take a different view of risk, to go into the unknown and take a thread or a beeline for the rest of us to follow, so that we can pull a rope up with that little thread, and then move humanity further out, I think becomes important. So with those three categories in mind, it's not just about going to Mars or playing with some asteroids or going to the moon. I think our generation right now, this generation happens to be uniquely positioned. And one could say that about every generation, of course, but uniquely positioned in this category, in that I believe we are at the cusp, genuinely this time, we are at the cusp of now increasing our ability to move out into space. This decade, I think we will get super heavy reusable launch vehicles operating effectively at low cost and robustly. So by 2030, the traditional bottleneck of the last 70 years of, wow, it really costs a lot to get 300 miles up to low Earth orbit, is not going to be the primary critical path bottleneck. Then it's going to be now, what do we do? What are the costs of operations? How do we manufacture? How do we deal with microgravity? All of these new discoveries are going to start to emerge as the issues. And so we are at we have a critical responsibility at this generation, in that what we do in the next 10 to 20 years, what you and I and everyone listening and all of us together do in the next 20 years may have a guiding influence on the next 1, 2, 300 years of how we go out into space. What is the nature of our governance structures, our principles of operation, our codes of conduct, even the technical standards and interfaces? All of these things are going to have almost a steering entity. This at the very start of any event, the slightest steer a few degrees left or right basically takes you off axis a million light years downstream. And I think what we have now is we have this influence in our generation. And apart from all of those things, the most overriding important aspect of the decisions we make now are about defining what is the nature and culture of our humanity as we go out into the solar system and out to the first stars. Who are we? What are the ideals we strive for? What is the definition of the highest ideals of the human species? And I think we need to reach into ourselves before we take these steps out. We need to reach into ourselves, force ourselves to elevate to the highest ideals of what are the principles that we choose to define who we are as we go out. And it's not that we will ever live by them or achieve them successfully, but by knowing what those ideals are, at least we can aspire and strive. And we have a reference point that when, as we go out to the outer planets and we have settlements around the Jovian moons, or we go through the Oort cloud and 200 years later, some colonies reach Proxima Centauri, perhaps. And we start moving out into the solar system over the galaxy over the next 1,000 years. The chances of cultural diversification and exploration become multifold, and that's very exciting. And so the question is, and that the liberty to do that is perfectly fine. But at the background, there should be a common thread that even if some groups choose to reject that and say, no, we choose to live in a different direction, wonderful, fine. But there should be a common thread, a point of reference of, this represents the highest ideals of who we are and who we could be. And that reference, having that reference as a common thread amongst our species as we become a 1 trillion person species and more, that common thread, I think, then gives us frames of cultural reference that however we grow and diversify as a species, we will be able to communicate across that diversification with a common thread or a common axis. It's almost like, the principle of the Rosetta Stone, basically the old language tablet that was found many thousands of years old. And it was basically a translation clue for multiple languages. This would be a cultural Rosetta Stone for our species that would enable us, as we explore out into the galaxy, to remember who we are and to remember the delta of what we've become, so that we can communicate across those gaps and bridges. And so I think, bringing it then back a little bit, this exciting journey that lays before us over the next few hundred to 1,000 years, as we really start to expand out into this side of the galaxy, I think is such an we're at such an exciting time where we can see these things becoming possible. And the first steps that we take, getting to low Earth orbit robustly, setting up manufacturing, research, life science explorations and investigations in low Earth orbit, moving to the moon, learning how to process in partial gravity, learning how to operate in environmentally challenging and aggressive situations and environments, and then moving perhaps to Venus, perhaps to Mars, and ultimately the next near-term goal is really the asteroid belt.
I see.
That is, in my view, the real prize and should be the real objective of this century, is to robustly get to the asteroid belt with advanced robotics that are autonomous and can process volatiles for fuel, for water, materials, and manipulate energy. And with that, we have a sea of unlimited resources, near unlimited resources in the mining industry.
Belt between the Saturn and
the primary asteroid belt between Mars orbit and Jupiter's orbit.
Got it.
That's right. So, we have Earth, then going to the sun, we have Venus, and then we have Mercury. But going outwards, we have Mars. Then there's a vast distance to the asteroid belt, and then a huge distance to Jupiter. But this asteroid belt was effectively a 10th planet that wasn't able to gravitarily coalesce at the formation of the accretion disk of our solar system. And so it's rich in resources. It's like having a whole planet of mineral, which is effectively an infinite reef, we call in the mining sector. And so this represents the real waypoint for this century. for which we can then build and go into all sorts of directions for the future.
That's great. One of the things that you mentioned was, to explore space to avoid extinction, and being, just going to bring up a question which is probably looking at it from a different angle. As smart as humans are, we leave a lot of mess and we do dumb things, right? So there's an argument to say that we have had 5 extinctions on this planet, and whenever humans interfere with nature, it doesn't generally end up in a good scenario. So is it not a question that comes up, which says, why not just take care of ourselves here on Earth? And if we're going to go extinct, that maybe is part of what universe has planned for us, and maybe that's part of evolution, which gives rise to another species down the road. Do you ever ponder about these type of questions?
I mean, yeah, our place in the universe and the anthropocentric perspective of whether humanity, our sentience has a right. Do we have a right to exist, or do we exist as a consequence of circumstances for which we have an obligation to be secondary to? Mm-hmm. Well, so I do believe the argument is asymmetric, and I do have a firm position on this. Mm-hmm. So my position is as follows. For the most part, the universe appears, as far as we know, to be unaware of itself. Matter is fundamentally inanimate. There is no agency. On Earth, in the habitable zone of our nearest star, the Sun, Earth has provided this oasis of life, all the chemicals and conditions necessary for life. In fact, the universe itself, the gravitational constant is on a knife edge of balance, mm-hmm. just right for chemistry and physics to operate effectively. So many fundamental constants of the universe are just on the knife edge, unbelievable knife edge of perfection, to enable this to occur, to enable us to have this inquiry together. And the very nature of the universe at a fundamental level of connectivity is that although we may be separate from our table and our computers in terms of sentience and agency, at least so far, in terms of agency, we are all bound by the inanimate laws of nature, of the universe itself. We're all part of the space-time fabric.
Yeah.
So we are nature. Hmm. We are all nature, and what one could, it may come a bit sideways to a Zen perspective, but one could say the rock is alive and we are alive, but at a certain level we are all connected. We are all made of the same atoms. We all obey fundamentally the same laws of physics in this part of the universe, at least. And so getting to the question of, well, what is our existential rights and what are our obligations? Well, on Earth, as if you imagine the pre-human era and then a post-human era, it is very clear that we've made severe impacts mm-hmm. to the surface of our planet and to our oceans. And it's probably quite clear that those impacts have been unintended, undirected. We have not been accountable, and we have not undertaken the majority of those impacts with responsibility for the ecosystem. We have not treated the Earth as an accounting system for which we have to account, and we are basically drawing debt from the Earth's environment, mm-hmm. and we have no idea of how we're paying that debt back. Yeah. That is fundamentally correct. So as a species, in relation to our local environment, we have basically been operating without consequence, and one could say irresponsibly to a certain extent. Now, but then that is the nature of life in some ways. Life disrupts. Life in itself is Darwinian, for want of a more generic term. I mean, the fact that we are ostensibly at the top of the food chain, that we are able to apply agency and intelligence to accelerate natural evolution and biology by orders of magnitude, it is to the detriment of many ecosystems on Earth and many environments on Earth. This is correct. This is a fair point. And as we go out into the solar system and beyond, humanity will disrupt the environment there as well. We will cause a mess. We will make mistakes. Hopefully we will learn as we go. We have the opportunity as we go from our closed Earth-based system out into the open space-based system, that we can, that's part of this culture that I was talking about, that we can elevate ourselves and operate with a different set of principles, that we can take the lessons here and not repeat them going forward. That, I think, is one of our key responsibilities. But to say that, well, maybe we should allow the universe to go its way, I don't believe that to be correct. I don't believe that to be valid. And the reason I don't believe that to be valid, because the opportunity for life, to love, to experience, to create agency, and to hope, and to dream, and to desire, and to strive, these are the fundamentals of any species that you see. And it's the race is against ourselves. Can we elevate our own cultural sensitivity and our more elevated perspectives so that we can understand how to better work and relate to the environment rather than just exploit it, because we have not done a good job of that. And when it comes to the question of, well, wouldn't it be better just to concentrate here on Earth before going to space? I mean, let me try and give an analogy. Let's say your house is on fire, and you don't want to go outside of the house to connect to a fire hydrant to use the external water to bring the hose. We're going to turn on all the taps in the house and hope that we can create enough water here to put the fire out. We are woefully undersupplied in the house by 100 to 1 or 1,000 to 1. We need to go outside of our house, get the larger resources, and bring the big resources in so that we can manage the problem that's happening here. So it just like anything, you kind of need to get out, to think out of the box, to access and harness energies that are outside of your system to be able to affect your system.
That's great.
And if we remain in a closed system, and if we remain earthbound, we will increase our probabilities that we will eventually perish as a species. But the journey to that the journey to that demise will be painful. Millions will suffer. Millions of families and children will live with poverty, starvation, increasing lack of resources. And I don't believe we need to see that future. I think even the world we have today, I find unacceptable. The fact that today, under this pandemic, there are apparently 800 million people today are short of food, or short of necessary food for healthy nutrition, and about 150 million people are on the edge of starvation today, April 2020. Which has been exacerbated by this pandemic crisis. And yet we live with these asymmetries in our society. And this cannot be acceptable. And so going out to harvest the bounty of the solar system as the first step will enable us to redress this balance, to think bigger than our national boundaries and our continental geography, and start seeing our entire human population as one species that has albeit the United Nations has the Charter of Equal Rights for all humanity. But you know what? I think it's time that we start executing on that
Yeah.
and living to that,
Yeah.
rather than just having it as good doctrine.
Yeah. No, I think a few things that you said there really resonated with me. Which is, one thing you said is, even that desire to expand and go outwards is part of universe. So if that desire has originated from somewhere, it is part of that universe. And to your point, when we have to represent ourselves as a unit, as a single unit, rather than talk about ourselves as Americans or Canadians or what have you. um, yeah, I mean, you need to come up with a common ground which you can use as a benchmark. And that's what we did with Voyager, when we sent out that golden disk and whatnot. So that's pretty relevant for sure. Now let's bring it to, as you mentioned, like, the current environment. And a lot is happening. A lot of people are under lockdown. Economies are being destroyed in the background. So what are your views? How are you dealing with all these challenges? You're managing a huge corporation. I'm sure it has caused disruption in your life and business. So first of all, how are you handling this challenge?
Well, we're very lucky. I mean, at Offworld, we're building autonomous machine intelligent robots that are ruggedized, modular, and operate in extreme environments such as mining, construction, and other areas like that, where they're unstructured environments. And our objective is to try and get people out of harm's way, that we don't have people doing dangerous manual labor in mines or on construction sites. And then once those neural nets and systems are mature, we'll then deploy them up to the lunar surface and into space and start that civilization building. And so, we've been lucky in terms of how our organization has dealt with this crisis, in that we can actually teleoperate our robots. So our developments that we're doing in the lab and what we want to do out in the fields and in the mines has a certain flexibility. So for the most part, our engineers are able to operate at home, and we're able to rotate in specific duty cycles of lab and machine shop based operations. So we're progressing reasonably well. But what this whole, I mean, again, hindsight is 2020, being the year 2020. Yeah? I mean, it's we'll look back at this year. I think this year is the real start of the 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
The 21st century has now started. Now our challenge, now our work is clear to us. Now the trials and tests of this generation have been defined. The fallout from this crisis is, from a societal perspective, I think is at least 3 years, 5 years.
Yeah.
From an economy's perspective and a commerce perspective is probably 10 to 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then from a national economy perspective, I think we're looking at between 200 and 400 years. The effect is going to be that big, because no time have we ever just switched off the economic engine.
Mm-hmm.
We have a $80-90 trillion economy, and if you switch that off for 1, 2, 3 months, I mean, that's $20-30 trillion
Mm-hmm.
of lost economy. Let's say there's a $20 trillion hit at a global level. Well, that's just in terms of commerce and productivity, let alone all of the government support and debt that is being generated just to keep people alive and with resources. This is basically uncharted territory. So the big question that I see is, structurally, how do we move forward as we emerge out of the immediate crisis? What is the rebuild strategy? what is our objective? What do we want to achieve? What do we want to see? Are we collectively saying, okay, virus is under control? Let's say 2 years time, 3 years time, vaccine is there, distribution is widespread, and for the most part, it's done. Is our objective going to be, let's get back to a 2019 world, and let's get that back as quickly as possible, and we will then carry on. By 2030, for the most part, the effect is gone, and it's mostly memory. Or do we want to say, this is just not good enough?
Yeah.
I do not feel that I want us as a species to go through that risk again. So what do we do? How do we improve? How do we improve our situation? How do we improve our city structures, our transport links, our medical and healthcare systems? What are the rights? I mean, in America has a very expensive healthcare system with a lot of opportunity to improve the delivery of those services.
Yeah, yeah.
And in fact, our global health culture is about mitigating pathology. We wait till someone has showing symptoms of something, and then we'll treat those symptoms.
Yeah.
Why don't we articulate the balances of preventative medicine, of health, of good quality of life, of understanding the mechanisms of our metabolism that allow us to self-repair to a far greater extent than our medical institutions seem to acknowledge. So there's all these opportunities for change, for evolution. And then you start to add in other technology curves, like robotics, machine learning, the wider field of artificial intelligence, synthetic biology and biotechnology, advanced connectivity, and connection with 5G and potentially satellite services, our ability to go out into the cosmos with increasingly robust systems. And you wrap all of that in the layers of increasing intelligence, machine intelligence, wrap that up in a layer of increasing fidelity of brain-computer interface and the ability to interact with machines, the connectivity that it will allow us in 10, 20 years, you and I may be able to communicate telepathically at some low resolution, just through brain-computer interface and likewise and back. Yeah. And what are the cultural changes that emerge once we can do that? Once I can communicate to my robots through thought, once you and I can communicate through thought, and we can collectively curate 100 robots or 1,000 robots to do something good. What are the checks and balances on that? How do we prevent someone from doing something bad? Mm-hmm. What happens if and when machine entities establish a sense of sentience and self-awareness? What if a machine comes back to us and says in 50 years time and says, I don't want to do that. Mm-hmm. I think it's dangerous. How do we define that event? Are we saying that is just a behavioral replica or a behavioral simulation of self-awareness and agency? And where do we, at what resolution do we, do multiple layers of Turing test and try and find out, is it really intelligent or is this just complex behavior? Because we could ask ourselves the same thing. There's especially some people we should ask more than others. But what is that? What is intrinsic consciousness? What is intrinsic soul? And where is the line between a set of complex behaviors so intricate that we can't see deep enough to know whether it's just algorithms mm-hmm. or there's a self-defining entity? But how do we ever know that distinction in ourselves either?
Yeah.
So I think coming out of this event, what I think the positives that we can draw from this terrible crisis, which we have been unprepared for, and even with the notice that we got, I don't think we moved quickly enough. And it's understandable. It's in our nature to be reactive as a species collectively. and it's in our nature to be hyper reactive as an individual, but we're slow to react the more individuals you collect together. And the bigger the entity, the more inertia the entity gets, till you get to nation state or species level. It takes an even bigger impact to make things move. But we have the opportunity to say, well, what do we want to create? What for the young people listening now and around the planet, this is the greatest opportunity, despite the costs, despite the suffering, despite the losses. This is the greatest opportunity for growth and to choose how we grow for a century, for 100 years.
Yeah, I think that's powerful, because I mean, this has been a great equalizer. Everybody's on square one, so it's a great opportunity to understand yourself a little bit better as well, and focus on the things that we were not able to do earlier, or what have you. We were telling our stories, or let me just focus on this because it's paying the bills and whatnot. So that's very relevant for sure. Now you mentioned a few stats. You mentioned it'll take 3 to 5 years for the health crisis, 10 to 20 years for the economy, and probably 200 years for the full fallout. Can we elaborate a little bit without going into too much like a scary thought, but maybe give some look at your crystal ball and give some idea to how people should be looking at this and making decisions in their personal lives and their professional lives?
Yeah. So, as again, so so a lot of this can be scary. A lot of it can be unnerving and stressful, especially for those who have great uncertainty about jobs, opportunities, are worried about their kids, or you're just out of college and like, oh my gosh, what do I do now? What happens now? But great plans are what you do until life gets in the way. And we have throughout history, every time there has been adversity, people, us, have on the whole risen to the occasion. So every one of us is afraid. We're all uncertain. We all reach moments of, gosh, I hope my friends are okay. I hope things will be okay. What do the kids do growing up? What are the futures going to be? And I think this is the opportunity for us is to understand that, what, within all of us, without question, when push comes to shove, every single individual is able to rise to the occasion. And again, we have grown comfortable, especially in the West, we've grown comfortable, for many of us, with an assumption of steady state infrastructure, that we have deliveries here, Amazon Prime will come later today or tomorrow, Netflix comes on, the power comes on, and all of these things become a steady state norm. Well, after the shock of change, we are able to adapt to what the next normal is.
Nice. Yeah.
And so the human mind and our spirit and our outlook is very adaptable. We're very plastic in that way. And it's no problem to feel concerned, but know that we are able to adapt, and we can adapt going forward. What becomes the distinctive mark of how each of us deal with this, is the choice we make. I recommend anyone listening to read Viktor Frankl's Meaning of Man.
Meaning of Man.
Yeah, Viktor Frankl. And it's basically the defining principle that between every input and every action that we undertake, is in the middle is choice. And the depth of our humanity, the expanse of our humanity, is defined by the amount of choice we can put in between an input and our reaction. And this is one of those moments where we could react and we could panic. But this is an opportunity for us to rise and to say, well, what do we choose? And what do we choose to do? This is like a gift of an opportunity for people alive today. And what we can choose to do can be a myriad of things. So firstly, to answer your question, there are operational and functional aspects, which I'll just touch on, but there are also some wider callings. This is one of those times where we should all think about, what is our calling? What can we do? Is it about food? Is it hunger? Is it water? Is it health? Is it any one of these? Is it my local community? Is it mitigating subsequent disasters? In the US, we may have fires on the West Coast, hurricanes on the East Coast. What does that do when we start having cascading disasters on top of this pandemic and economic crisis? Will there be civil unrest? What can I do to mitigate that? So there are calls of duty that we can all rise to, that can inspire us, inspire our family and friends and those around us, and we can come together with a calling for the greater good. And so I do urge people to think about that, because the opportunity to do something great and to look back and to say to your children and your grandchildren during the great pandemics of the 20s and the time after, this is what we did and this is what I did. And that's important. That's important because it inspires and it leads and it serves as examples to those growing up looking at you for guidance. And then at an operational level, in terms of education, in terms of work, in terms of family, I mean, I think the way the world is going, there are one of the major concerns is the increasing divides in our population, economically, educationally, aspirationally, and opportunistically. Some people just don't have the opportunity to do something. They don't have access to internet or power, or food or water. This should be unacceptable. This is, if this was a Star Trek episode and Kirk or Picard came in the Enterprise to this planet and they see this species with all of these resources and technology, and yet whole continents or whole countries are living at levels of access to resources that are just below acceptable. This would have been one where, Riker and Picard have been arguing about the, prime directive, and they're like, these guys need a slap, to wake up. And so we should not find this acceptable. So I think everyone should educate themselves, get onto courses about coding and robotics and AI and synthetic biology. Look at the emerging technology curves that are coming up and have some fun getting into them. And anyone can start just getting into them. There's no rush. You can take 5-10 years. It's a constant learning game. But it's important that as we get to 2030, that every adult today has an awareness of what's going on in the emerging research and technology fields, so that they can guide their children in their educational journeys. Because we want to, why is every child on earth not being educated to the highest standards or given the opportunity to choose those standards? That has to change. That has to change. And in terms of workflow, I think the opportunities for employment and for work right now, this what has been brought into such a stark contrast today is the essential workers. That at least we define them here in the United States. The essential workers. I mean, God bless the doctors and nurses who are just 24/7 at the front line. But again, all of the gig economy crew, the essential, grocery workers, delivery workers, post office folks, everyone who's staying up and running and working through this, for the most part, and forgive me if I don't wish to cause insult or raise the issue. But for the most part, these are occupations that are not paid enough. They're not paid enough. They're not resourced enough. They're overworked. I'm talking generally. They're overworked, and healthcare is perhaps not consistent, and the opportunities for growth and to elevate are not really considered. And this is something we've all been guilty of taking for granted. And I think we need to move into an era where we take a long, hard look at all of these roles, and just say, look, what can we automate now? Why are we having a human being with dreams and aspirations for the purpose of generating enough to feed themselves and their family, are having to do this because the opportunity isn't open to them to do something better? This cannot go on either, because this pandemic draws into sharp relief the other existential risks that we have of climate change, of ocean pollution. The oceans are even more susceptible to pollution, environmental damage than our atmosphere. We have to be extremely careful with that we don't disrupt that. And all of these other things, now we've got a heightened awareness. The only way to address any of this is to not try and pick at some small thing here or there. It's for us as a species to step back and say, you know what? This is a connected system. What are we doing as an approaching 8 billion person species? If we reach 10 billion person, if we double our energy consumption and our mineral extraction consumption, this is just not going to stop. There are many who say the pandemic occurred through cross-fertilization of viral strains across species, because these species are pushed into overlapping environments because of our deforestation and etc., or our cultural perspectives of bringing species together, or just the irresponsibility that we sometimes operate on. And so we will be taking a step back. Many of us will be taking a step back and saying, how do you create a big picture challenge board and say, this isn't about stopping another pandemic. This isn't about the health of the oceans. This isn't about atmospheric advantage or sea level rising or health or better worker rights or education. What is the fundamental direction of the human species over this century? Because unless we address it at that level, we will not have a chance to turn the tide. Yeah. So we need to take a collective view, the biggest picture view we can, and understand how we can better manage our species, because the risks are only going to get worse.
Yeah.
And that's why we all need to rise to the challenge for this. But I think there's going to be amazing opportunities for education, for work. So it's going to be disruptive for another year or two. But I think the real uncertainties are going to diminish rapidly in the next few months, because economies will come back up and running, and there will be, I am absolutely certain, there will be even artificial cycles of economy that drive productivity, that drive economic growth, just for the fact that, okay, the salaries may rise, restaurant, go out to a restaurant, the bill may be higher. I've done a few deliveries and kind of put a massive tip for the drivers. I think there's going to be a cultural drive to really try and help and compensate for those who have some advantage and were lucky enough to be able to continue doing what they're doing. It's our responsibility to support our ecosystem and bring that up rapidly as possible. So things are going to be a bit shaky for a while. They're going to be a little artificial and skewed, but the new jobs and new opportunities are going to emerge. And I think as robotics and automation are getting a big shout out right now, like, where are the robots? Man, this was a time we needed robots to allow the social distancing to work more effectively. But in some senses, why are we having people, wonderful, inspired human people with dreams? Human people, you humans. why we're having people doing things that they're just doing to earn a living. Let's break that. Let's allow people to have their subsistence and basic living needs satisfied by whatever mechanism, whether it's work, whether it's universal income, whatever it is. Let's separate essential productivity from inspirational activity, and let's allow people to grow, to self-educate, to then find new opportunities. And I think I'm very excited about the potential for what we can do going forward.
Yeah. No, this is every time I talk to you, I get a message of hope and a lot of clarity. And this was much needed. What you just said. This is a time of opportunity. So rather than being negative or just look at what is not available, what is not possible, I think we should be looking at possibilities. And I think you just opened up whole new world for viewers who actually listens to this and listen to it and actually implement it in their life. So thank you so much. I'd love to bring you on for another interesting conversation. I think like we have a lot to talk about, but in the interest of time, I have to let you go. But how can people reach out to you if they want to connect with you, want to learn more about your company and what you're doing?
So find me on LinkedIn, Jim Keravala. Connect up with me on LinkedIn, and we'll go from there.
Awesome.
Happy to say hi.
Thank you so much once again for being on the show.
Thank you very much. Be safe, everyone. Take care.